Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome all of you, our attendees here and followers through the social media to this seminar in which we will be discussing the Army and the Rapid Support Force conflict in the Sudan. To discuss the current conflict and the future of the crisis. And please allow me, first of all, to introduce the panelists very briefly. With us in the first intervention, Dr. Ahmed Abushouk. He will be telling us about the roots, political and military roots of this conflict. Dr. Ahmed Abushouk is a professor of political and historical studies from. He got his PhD from Bergen University. He taught there, and then later on he taught at the International Islamic University in Malaysia, then a visiting lecturer in Berlin, at Berlin University during different periods of time, and then in Pittsburgh, then Wisconsin, and he has more than 20 books and 70 papers to his name. After that, we will move to Dr. Hamid Ali. His intervention will be on a national project to build a modern state in the Sudan. He is the dean and associate professor of the School for Political Studies at the Doha Institute, and he is one of the founders of the public policies programs, and formerly a professor at American University in Cairo. He has many publications to his name on the Darfur and the public expenditure and conflicts in the Sudan. After that, we will listen to Dr. Abdelwahab El-Affendi. He will be presenting on militias and the political impact of that. He has a PhD from Reading University, and he is a provost at the Doha Institute, and formerly he was head of the postgraduate studies department, and before that he was the head of the Islamic Studies program at Westminster University. He taught in 5 continents and has many books in his name. The last speaker will be Mr. Hamza Baloul. He was formerly Minister of Information and an editor-in-chief of many newspapers. We start with Dr. Ahmed Abushouk. You have about 20 minutes, Dr. Ahmed. Please, the floor is yours. In the name of God, the most merciful, the most compassionate, and may the blessings of God be upon His messenger. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening to you all. I spoke here from this platform about 3 years ago at the beginning of the December Revolution, and I was hoping to come back after 3 years to talk about the democratic transmission and transformation. Unfortunately, that's not to be the case, and in view of the current war in the Sudan, I'm compelled to talk about a different topic. I remember I sent an invitation to a dear friend, and he asked me, what can I talk about in such a seminar? And he asked me the same thing. I told him I'll be talking about the roots of this problem and its impact. He said, "You academicians, you always are captive to history, and you never present a solution. And if you had an objective contribution, then we wouldn't have got to where we are now." So, bearing that in mind, in any way, I decided to take that thought into consideration and decided to tackle my presentation from 3 points of view. First of all, any solution and resolution would require an objective analysis of the root causes of this conflict, because the past can lead us, if dealt with objectively and the proper methodologies are implemented, can enable us to make a proper, correct reading, because understanding any crisis from its root causes can help us to understand the present in an objective way, away from emotional discourse, and this would lead us to the question as to what lessons we can heed from this analysis, and what can we do so far as our thinking processes are considered to reread the past and understand it in order to explore the prospects of the future, and to think of how can the state in the Sudan, post-conflict Sudan, can be in a way which can bypass the way we thought and which led us to the current situation. Because Japan after World War II and Rwanda after a civil war, but this vision requires nationalist leaders who think in terms of the national interests away from their sectorial interests. I will try in my presentation to look at the root causes of this conflict, because the title is not enough, because this is a more complex conflict. It's not just a conflict between the army and the rapid support force. It has a regional and an international dimension, and also we must not forget the transformation into democracy, if anything is left of that process. If we look at the reality now which produced the revolution, can be understood through this timeline, how it started and how it developed through a accumulation of injustices and grievances. That's why people who supported the revolution supported it. They agreed on the necessity to depose the system, but did not agree on the basis of the proper democratic transformation. For this reason, the population was divided into the supporters of the revolution and the ones who supported the counter-revolution or stood against the revolution. Then we move to the question of the Sudanese army and the RSF, how the Sudanese army was formed, how it was established, and why did it make the RSF a support unit. The Sudanese army was established in 1924 after the movement by a number of military academy cadets, and because the British colonialist power was keen on getting rid of the Egyptian component. For this reason, the Sudanese Protection Force was established in 1925, which after independence the name was changed to the Armed Forces of the Sudanese Army after independence and the nationalist governments came to power. After that, during the Islamic system or regime, in the transition period, it's called the Army of the Sudan. Then it was called the Armed Forces, and finally the People's Armed Forces. And the last law, which is being referred to as the amended 2007 law. For this reason, from a legal point of view, the army was established as a main component of the post-colonial state in the Sudan. So many people are wondering now, has this institution managed to keep to its professionalism, to be the guardians of the constitution? There are many question marks here, and in response to these question marks, we cannot blame the military establishment only, because the political parties share in the blame from 2 points of view. First, through the way the recruitment system is, political parties resorted to recruiting their own followers within the military establishment to use them as a force they can fall back on in case of conflict. So therefore, many soldiers or military personnel were recruited on the basis of their political affiliation, because the law says that the armed forces are a regular non-partisan force, and all Sudanese can be recruited regardless of religion, creed, or any other consideration. The military establishment also took part in military coups supported by political parties in 1969, in 1958, 1969, 1989, and 2019. So this has led to these question marks when it comes to taking an objective look at the army as an institution. So is the RSF is equal to the army? No, the Army's command made the RSF as a support unit, as a paramilitary force to aid the army in the of a tribal makeup, and the idea was to support the army when it fought civil wars and conflicts and insurgencies. In 1919, it was a tribal militia, paramilitary force, used to be called the border guards. When when the commander, who was an illiterate person in 2019, was appointed as commander and given the rank of brigadier general. From an institutional point of view, the hierarchy of the army started with the supreme commander, then the minister of defense, and the president, whereas the RSF was the supreme commander and the president. So therefore, the supreme commander of the army and the minister of defense were removed from the chain of command, the hierarchy of the RSF. So therefore, it is a body which is not gone through any professional standards, nor did it follow the rules and regulations of the army, and it's a tribal fighting force because the whole allegiance and the loyalty command is through one family. Hamid was given the rank of lieutenant general. On what basis? And he was appointed as the deputy chair of the Council of Sovereignty or Sovereign Council. For this reason, the leadership of the RSF began to see itself as a rival of the army, and hence all the rivalry and the other ill feelings that started appearing. The third aspect is the contradictions in the political scene in the Sudan. After the revolution, the so-called the revolution and change forces on the one hand and the military component, both these components agreed on the formation of a transitional government, and we noticed that the military component, when the negotiations started on establishing a transitional government, the military was divided after the first objective of the deposing of the former regime was established. There was division into three parts, and then the role of the regional powers started interfering, pushed by different reasons. First of all, the positioning of the United States, who wants to have full hegemony on the Horn of Africa, and secondly, the question of gold reserves, because the UAE, Russia, and Hamid were involved in. Number three was the question of Yemen, whereby the UAE and Saudi Arabia got involved. And in addition to all of that is the struggle over the River Nile between Egypt and Ethiopia. This is how we should look at this conflict. So what happened after the formation of the transitional government? I think there are two basic problems which appeared to the surface. First of all, the circumstantial alliances, which were based on a partial power sharing. Secondly, the lack of the proper national vision when it comes to preparing the ground for the democratic transition. And as a result of this circumstantial alliances, three alliances were born. The first was bilateral between the revolution and change forces and the military component. They managed to come up with the constitutional document, and then the freedom and change alliance was fragmented into two more or three more factions, and as a result of that, there was a power struggle at the center, and as a result of which another transitional alliance was formed, which was not based on the national interest but on partisan interests, like the alliance between the Revolutionary Front, the forces of liberty and change, and the military component. And after the Juba agreement, now the military and the struggle between the forces of liberty and change, as was Hamdok described as something which will lead to a disaster. This led to the October 25th coup. Here we're faced with a crisis because the civil revolutionary forces did not manage to form a government for more than 1 year, and many initiatives surfaced to solve this dilemma, and in the end, the so-called framework agreement appeared, and so therefore the framework agreement was not the only cause, but it was the straw that broke the camel's back. If we move to if you try to understand this crisis in 1 minute, so therefore this is the last slide. The framework agreement divided the political scene into two camps, the camp of the supporters and the camp of the opponents. The supporters of the framework included the freedom and change because they thought they can form a minority government and do away with the military component and benefit from the RSF as a force they can fall back on, because the framework agreement did not give a timeline for the integration of the RSF with the army, and made the RSF subservient and subjected to the authority of the head of state, who was not appointed. And also the army wanted a transitional period of 2 years for the integration, thinking that would enable it to get rid of Hamid. And the other side called for proportional representation, 47%. The army opposed that because the agreement, the framework agreement did not stipulate that, and also the forces which belong to the other component also described it as exclusionist, and this is not the bottom line. The framework agreement called for the dismantlement of the 30th of June regime and to get rid of the supporters of the previous regime. So I'll conclude by saying that what are the Marwan, if you give me 1 more minute, please. The first scenario is to break the back of the RSF, and the army can do that if they want, and after that the remainder of of the RSF can be integrated into the army, and a de facto national government can be formed, and which can call for an election supported by outside help. The second scenario, the continuation of the Jeddah negotiations and institute the causes of this crisis again by consolidating Al-Burhan and Hamid in their positions. And the third scenario is for this war to expand horizontally and lead to, God forbid, a civil war. And by that, this will be the end of the state of Sudan. And thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed, for your intervention that tries to shine light on the current crisis taking place and also to delineate the map of the different political powers in keeping with the recent crisis. So the percentages that you have dedicated to the different scenarios, I fear that they might be reversed. The second speaker is Dr. Hamid Ali. Dr. Hamid is going to talk about a national project for a civil and democratic state in Sudan. You have 20 minutes. Thank you very much. So the opening is about the building of a national democratic project, and my proposition entails that we should have a lot of hope in Sudan after the incidents that took place. We do expect, particularly after the national catastrophe that has manifested and the war, we are promised to have some hope, and the war has prevailed, and it has reached the capital, the urban area in Sudan. Perhaps this is going to lead to some hope for the future of Sudan. And I would like to talk about four solutions, more than talking about the crisis itself. Dr. Abushouk talked about the crisis. I think that the Sudanese revolution came with a number of contents. So freedom, peace, and justice. These are slogans for equal citizenship in the state, for citizens to be free in their own countries, enjoying their rights and duties. So no political affiliation would impact such rights. So that is why there was a call for the building of a state of democratic institutions and democracy. The different revolutionaries called for the reform of the military establishment as one of the demands of the revolution and to build a democratic community. I think that the transitional phase, so instead of concentrating on the building of institutions, unfortunately led to a bloody conflict. The most important challenge that we are facing as Sudanese entails that we have to come up with ideas after this bloody crisis and to deal with the root causes of the crisis. And this entails that we should think in depth after this region about this matter. So the RSF as a military force has become a threat, and this has led to the fact that the military changed its tactics. So the most important challenge is how can we contribute to the delineation of the future of the state in a way that would preserve its entities and also to achieve comprehensive peace, peace that would prevail in all parts of Sudan, where all people, simple people, would be able to benefit and enjoy such peace. People in Nuba, we do not want these to be privileges of power that are enjoyed by people who are seeking power or living in such circumstances. And the most important challenge entails also that exerted efforts and concerted should be made. There should be a patriotic will whereby the new political scene should be created because educated people, such people have dissociated themselves, and this had led to a vacuum. And the situation has led to an absurd situation, an environment. So that is why we have to try to establish freedom, justice, and to build a democratic state. Also, representation should be comprehensive. All components of the state should be represented. We should not fall into fanatism because this only leads to failure. The priority entails that we should stand against any attempts that try to reinstate the crisis. Everybody is against the war, but we do not want to see a reinstatement of those who have led to failure. We do not want any attempts to be made as such under the banner of no to war. So that is why there should be a movement that should carry out its patriotic job far away from any authority affiliations or partisan affiliations. Priority should be dedicated to how to build Sudan, how to have a democratic state, a state for all people. Particularly, we have to make sure that we do not fall under the power of the different militias because this constitutes a huge threat and Sudanese people are paying a very dear price. What are the options available for the transitional phase? One of the most important things that my colleague talked about is the military. So, one of the most important priorities is to build a national army that should be the backbone of the state. We have seen that the armed forces suffer from a number of distortions, and amongst the distortions is that the army interferes in the political sphere. And also, we have seen the use of militias, and we have generals with no armies. And also, we have also partiality. So, to join the military college, you have to have certain affinities with certain groups. So, ranks are held by people from Kordofan and some other areas in Sudan. So, cronyism is one of the most important things that should be fought. So, many of those people from Kordofan and Darfur were against the state. So, that is why the forces they resorted to subcontractors. Here we're talking about the Janjaweed forces that have developed, and they are now called the Rapid Support Forces. These rapid support forces, these are forces that have developed, that have prevailed, that have expanded. They have security relations with the Zionist entity, and they have expanded politically, and they have militarized the political and economic spheres. And now, Hamid is one of the richest people in Africa. His wealth is thought to be between 12 to 13 billion dollars. And one of the most difficult things that have happened is that rapid support forces have been given a lot of power and they have been appointed for the economic emergency. So many of those military persons were in charge of getting oil, fuel, and wheat. I had a colleague who used to work in the field. He said, we were able to make Hamid get all those billions of dollars, and his military power increased to 118,000, and the same applies to his wealth. It has expanded and increased. So that is why putting an end to the RSF entails that we dismantle the economic structure he relies on. Because when you have resources, you can recruit and you can do whatever you want. So the dismantlement of the economic and military structures is very important. So these forces can be contained and included in the armed forces. And one of the priorities that the government should undertake, they have to contain members of the different armed forces in keeping with international standards. So it is very important to do that. So that is why the current leadership has to give the opportunity to new leaders to take over in order to reform the structures. And also, there are a number of humanitarian priorities, particularly in the short term. In keeping with the IOM, there is approximately 700,000 have sought refuge in other countries, and there are 3,200,000 in Darfur and in the southern part of the Blue Nile. They need urgent support, and all violations should be stopped. And this is in coordination with the different neighboring countries. And also, the IDPs should be able to go back to their areas, to their lands and countries, because the more this goes protracted, the more people would try to seek other alternatives. And Egypt is also keen to find solutions to this crisis. And the third priority is economic reform. Sudan has many, many capabilities. So the option that Sudan has is to produce. So you cannot just rely on grants. Grants would restrict you. You have $60 billion of debt, and we have made concessions. That is why we, as a state, as an agricultural state, we have to concentrate on agriculture, and we have to rehabilitate this sector as a priority, and we have to work and create clusters, industrial clusters around the agricultural lands in order to have added value. And also we have to develop and also support small enterprises in order to create job opportunities, and also to develop the banking system for funding, and also the rentier funds should be dedicated to the development of these sectors. Because when you talk about these resources, so many of the resources that we have are depletable. So the state now should invest in education and health. And of course, 80% of the productions happen in Sudan, but the products are exported and people do not benefit. I think if we concentrate on agriculture, in 5 years, the state of Sudan would be able to find an exit from this crisis without needing to beg or to be part of any programs. So transitional justice is also another component. So impunity has become one of the traits of politics in Sudan. So killings, imprisonments, and all of these things are forgotten. These catastrophes have been repeatedly manifested and seen. This has happened in South Sudan. We say, may God forgive us. And also, we have seen that manifest greatly in Darfur killings, and the killing has reached Khartoum. And we are talking about the same perpetrators, the same actors who have carried out these catastrophes in South Sudan and in Darfur. That is why we have to have judicial justice institutions where there is separation of power. They work professionally without any politicization, and they help the country and they try to achieve transitional justice because it is in our interest to have transitional justice because we all believe that the judicial system is fair. If there are institutions people who have been working during the transitional justice should be also held accountable for their corruption. People have looted, have taken funds, so there should be reviews for that transitional period because justice principles should prevail without any polarization and also to work on external relations. There are so many organizations. We're talking about 19,000 voluntary organizations, 2,000 of which are national organizations, and 17,000 are foreign organizations. They spend $1.5 billion. 1.5, most of such funds are dedicated to salaries and so on. We have 13 organizations that are part of the UN. We have the Quartet, we have the African Union agencies. So there is no cheaper country than Sudan, and this is due to political failure and the failure of the political leadership. We do not want to have organizations that would be tools for political formation. No, we want to have developmental organizations. And now we live under trusteeship. We need to work on par with other countries, with the region, with international agencies. The most important interest that should be paid heed to is the interest of Sudan. We do not want to take grants. The president goes and takes 10 billion and comes back. They make politicians really cheap. We have to stop this gross interference in the interests of Sudan, grave interference, I think, in Sudan. Let's think in an abstract way. So we do not want to think only about the short term. We would like our youth to be part and parcel of the political scene. These are revolutionaries that had been excluded from the revolution. They should lead the future because they are the future. What is the last thing that I would like to talk about? The future is being formed before our eyes. That is why we would like to have new leaderships that would represent the different groups that had been harmed in the East and in Darfur. We do not want this to be limited only to conflict zone and far from the leadership that is behind the destruction and behind the collapse and failure. That is why we have to have trust, confidence, and hope in the capabilities of this people and its youth in order to build peace, freedom, and justice. Without such hopes, we're going to fall into irrational absurdity. So these things should not be tackled. We should not be drawn into defeatism as a way of thinking. We have learned from the revolutionaries, we have learned from their sacrifices. This is very clear in the slogans of the revolution. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. So this is in response to your friend talking about a proposal for a solution. So Hamid Ali talked about that. Thank you, Dr. Hamid. So this is in defense for academics. The third speaker is Dr. Abdelwahab El-Affendi, and his intervention is militias and the militarization of civil dynamism. May the peace and blessings of God be upon you all. I would like to welcome the people present with us here. Everybody is aspiring to find some wisdom come out of this discussion. In actual fact, I shouldn't have taken the floor because I do write continuously about these subjects. I talk and write about the present time. I give pieces of advice on time as opposed to historians. Normally, I used to be insulted, I used to be criticized and accused. I hope that you wouldn't get that today. These things do not concern me or scare me. During a period of time, there was repression, popular repression, and also people used to fear talking. They would say things in private and fear to repeat the same thoughts in public because they would fear to be described as being like this or like that. But I would like to be brief here, and I have a theory that I worked on for some time, and I applied this theory. So I talked about narratives of insecurity. These narratives play a very important role when it comes to polarization and militarization. So the story starts with the populism in the West, similar to the West and so on. So saying that perhaps we're going to become strangers in our countries due to migrants or immigrants and so on, or this movement wants to dominate us and wants to prevail. I was working on Darfur for some time, and I was talking to one person, and he said, "We are targeted." When they say that, who do they mean? They mean us, and we are defending ourselves. And he was part of the same militia from which Hamid appeared. He said, "We're not defending the regime, we're defending ourselves because we are targeted." So these narratives, the same applies when the war erupted in the south. There were some persons who said that John Garang is going to occupy the north and stand against Arabism and Islam, and we have to stand against him. So the transitional phase, what has happened, it was something similar to these narratives that the Islamists and the deep states will do that, and we have to take revenge, and we have to do this, and we have to do that. And as a result of that, we have had what is called a sense of defensiveness, and also people started making other people, intimidating them, making them feel scared, and they're trying to increasingly become extremist. And we have seen that. We had our friends Hamza, Rifaq, and also Freedom and Change. They had a discourse which is a kind of a radical discourse. But after them, some of those people that have appeared, they call them traitors. And they say that they have become part of the resistance committees. And now people resort to silence and do not want to say the truth and also believe in being moderate. We, in the Arab Center for Research, we hosted a workshop and a conference in February 2019. So during that conference, we were able to gather different components of the public opinion, and we were able to reach a kind of consensus as to how we would be able to achieve change by consensus and in a seamless way to have a transitional phase. But during that period of time, the regime members they mocked us. What revolution are you talking about? These are youth that have taken to the street. These things have happened, and this is going to end. At some point, one person from the intelligence, Salah Goush, he said, "These are things that are arranged by ourselves. We can stop them tomorrow." So the revolutionaries said, there's no dialogue. So we continue with this story. We following it, and we had. But after that, we had the command massacre, and I had written an article in June 2019. In that article, I talked about the agreement that was going to be concluded then, and I said that there are many caveats when it comes to this agreement, when it comes to freedom and change and the military, but perhaps for the time being, there is no alternative, and this entailed that people should have worked during that period of time in order to build a real democracy. And I mentioned that democracy entails that we should have they should have a constitution that would limit the power of the ruler and would guarantee to all components of the community their security, and also to have a consensual kind of constitution. So
In the article, I also talked about removing not only the army but guns out of politics altogether, and I said many dictatorial regimes in the world are civilians, and when what is called as military rule is this is what when a colonel or brigadier or whatever makes a coup, the first thing he does is turns against the army so that he can elevate himself with the rank of lieutenant general, like what Gaddafi said, made the highest rank is colonel. For example, Bashar al-Assad is not a military general. He is a physician, but he rules the country, and the intelligence service are running the country. So therefore, it's the role of an individual or a group or a junta or something, and so that in order to save the country from militarization and military rule, then there should be constitutions and laws uh, safeguarding people's safety and basic liberties and freedoms, and also something which has been in Sudan and still is with the so-called civil movements have a military component, an armed wing, because they say they defend or they protect civil movements and they keep their guns. So in this case, there should be dialogue, and I followed that article with another one before, about 3 months before the coup by Al Burhan. I said there is no civil rule without dialogue. So if if you want to reject any dialogue and impose your will, then the only way you can manage that is through having an armed militia you can use. So therefore, for this reason, this civilians come to you and say, yes, let's engage in dialogue, and say, I'm here ready to engage in dialogue, but if you don't listen to me and do what I want, I have an army waiting somewhere who's ready to deal with you. So therefore, anything to do with civilian to have self restraint, to be tolerant of the others, accept the others. These points I repeated on many occasions, and that we should get rid of this entrenched positions. And I also said the civil forces should unite, and the military influence comes from the fact that the civilians are in disarray. So therefore, this framework agreement, I mentioned this at the time. This is a formula for war because it gives Hamid impunity from any internal reform, and the new constitution was talking about making the army subject to civilian political oversight, the prime minister, and so therefore the prime minister can remove the commanders of the army, but the RSF was protected from that, and it was given 10 years until integrated into the army. We know in 4 years he increased his forces from 20,000 to 120,000, and they are present deployed everywhere. So after 10 years, it will be an undisputed force. So therefore, this was an explosive formula, and the civilian forces were very weak politically, because it's true that they had the power at some stage, but through divisions and subdivisions, they lost a lot of their popular support, and they had this the radical reform change is looked at as worse than Islamist and the Muslim Brotherhood. So therefore, they didn't have any popular support to influence or pressurize any leverage on the army. So therefore, those who committed the massacre of the headquarters, is it feasible that these people signed an agreement whereby they subjected themselves to be held accountable? I don't want to take too much. This all of this is published in the Al-Arabi Al-Jadid. There is something which is rare, I say about myself. When I used to criticize this, people used to accuse me of not understanding anything. I used to say, yes, I wish I'm wrong and I don't understand, but I hope that the opposite would happen. I said we will end up in a situation like Sierra Leone, where the state would collapse unless the civil powers built on consensus started a civil administration. Otherwise, Sudan will disintegrate. I hope I'm wrong now. Thank you, Dr. Abdelwahab. Final speaker is Mr. Hamza Baloul. Good afternoon. I greet you all, and this is an important issue. We should have, as Sudanese and friends of Sudan, should have thought this over to avoid this current disaster, and I don't think there is a disaster bigger than war. There are some information that I really need to correct and discuss with the panelists because I was close to the negotiations and there are some information which is missing, and then after that we can, because the issue opens questions as much as it provides answers. I think there are more questions now than there are answers. The framework agreement is not the reason for this war. The war has nothing to do with it. The framework agreement was a way to deal with the situation after the military coup, and many civilian Sudanese politicians thought that the obstacles during the transitional uh, government and the military coup was all an attempt to avoid democratization that we all were dreaming of, and people, when they went out in revolution, the slogans were clear and apparent. There was an attempt to destroy that so that no peace nor justice can be. And on the 25th of October, the coup, everything that can go against the revolution happened. This was a project. But so far as politicians are concerned, this was not the end of the line. People engaged in the biggest national debate in order to go back to the process of transition. And this comprehensive national debate, although everybody who took part were convinced of democratic transformation, it has withdrawn many people who wanted to go back to the transition because many people thought that this regime is irredeemable, and the debate on which the framework agreement was built on was aimed at avoiding the mines which were exploding in our faces in the transition field, like the question of army and the security. And this document I hold in my hand was agreed on by everybody on the reform of the army and security forces, and also the membership of all the countries who are going to take part in this was supervised by the Liberty and Change. Then Liberty and Change plus the forces who signed the framework agreement. This was agreed on by the military and the civilian components as who should be part of the framework agreement and on what basis and according to what standards. There are very important issues, chief among which exploded later on into this war was how to reform the military and the security forces. But the most important point that the civilians and the military agreed on, that the RSF would be integrated into armed forces in a period which did not exceed 10 years. That the total period should not exceed 10 years, and then the stage of reunifying the command and the different branches and subdivisions. This point this point was signed by Al-Burhan, Hamid, and the civilians. Any other talk is not based on any spaceless. This is the document which was agreed on. Any talk about RSF and when it should be integrated came later and appeared later. And to say that there is RSF and the civilians or the Liberty and Change Forces and the RSF. The facts testify to the contrary of that. The first fact is any alliance between a civilian side and the military side can lead to war with another side. We as civilians, our basic interest is transition. The war for us is the biggest nightmare and for us and our future, because the moment the war started, the people started discussing with the two warring factions, and the civilians and the political components withdrew. So what's happening in Sudan is a real disaster. So what is happening is detrimental to the future of the Sudanese. This other point is negotiations between liberty and change, because they were the people who had this coup against them, and the military component. Very few meetings were attended by the components of the RSF. After that, he left to Darfur, and months passed, and the agreement on most of these points were attended, the meetings were attended by the military council, and the RSF was not presented. And people used to say that Hamid can come from Darfur in any minute and he will dismantle everything. The surprise was the RSF as an establishment studied this and said that this is a logical solution, that our problem is they have an conflict between them, and the RSF commander said, we made a mistake in taking part in the coup, and there is different platforms now. The former regime, which created the RSF, and then started attacking the RSF, and they started calling them a militia, although the RSF was moved to a regular force in 2014 when Sadiq al-Mahdi said this force should not be present. He was accused of treason and he was put in prison, and they accused him of high treason in the parliament of the former regime. These are the facts behind the scenes. The RSF as an institution was built in the days of the former regime, and they supported it in the Al-Burhan era, and for reasons which belong to the Al-Burhan. The Sudanese army had nothing to do with integrating the RSF. When in Juba, some of the separatists said that RSF will be part of the armed forces, the chief of staff said no. Only the forces belonging to the separatist movements will be integrated to the army, to the police force and other security forces, and the RSF. And this statement was given to the Blue Nile channel, and you can refer to. This is one point. So the military establishment did not have any desire. Al-Burhan himself issued a decree where he abolished the article pertaining to the RSF law. The article which Burhan cancelled or abolished was the subjugation of RSF to the armed forces laws. At the time of war or emergencies, the RSF are subjected to the Armed Forces Law 2007. This article was abolished by Al Burhan and not the Forces of Liberty and Change. And also, the integration of the RSF to the armed forces should be subjected to the law of 2007. So, by a decision by Al Burhan, who was the commander of the army, and the only body which discussed that the RSF should be integrated into the armed forces was the discussions within the framework agreement and with the presence of the RSF and the military establishment and this document is the basis of that. And they said, without the agreement on this, we will not take one step with you. And then both sides amended that, and then they agreed that the integration should be within a period which did not exceed 10 years. So what we warned against on many, many occasions is if we don't go all the way regarding the implementation of the framework agreement, is the eventuality of war breaking out, because at the end of this dispute will be war. Why? Because there are two institutions, two establishments, and in both of them the former regime is still there, the remnants of the former regime are there, and there are armed forces from both sides, and there were other people who were brought in to cause a military confrontation, and 20 phones were found. Bashir, Nafa, the 20 phones were taken from people on a bridge, and they were in contact with people, and the forensics lab, the digital forensic lab, said they found like 2,000 pages of conspiracy against the political scene, and many people were arrested, and the General Prosecutor's Office issued warrants to arrest many people, and the conspiracy failed. So therefore, some people who are wanted by the International Criminal Court from the remnants of the former regime, the RSF was not keen on integration. Even the 10-year point is what we agreed on. And Burhan himself, when he abolished the article, then that made the RSF a parallel force to the army. And when the RSF became a parallel force, now the real description of what's happening, there is a war between two armies. By law, they are both designated as so the solution should be an integration which is gradual and phased in, because any quick integration would lead to confrontation, and in the end there are some 10-15 people who have, this is the last chance for them. They are the only ones who have an interest in the war to escape the consequences, and there are clear statements attributed to them, and like the Kober prison, they had they could have taken them by a helicopter to any area. Only areas where there was conflict was Darfur and another governorate. So the rapid support force could have sent a helicopter and taken these people away. So Muhammad Harun said we had he said we had a problem when and all of this problem could have been avoided by taking these wanted people and handed over. Now there is a big responsibility on both parties. Any condition for a trial of the people who are wanted by the International Criminal Court should mean that the state should be willing to hand them over. Other than they should either they should try them or hand them over. Uh, or imprison them, the solution, the logical and legal solution is anybody who arrests them should hand them over because the Sudan does not need any more trouble. They are accused of killing people, distributing arms to the people, and they are responsible for the killings of thousands of people. So therefore, we should not deal with them from behind the scenes. The Sudan is facing many catastrophes. War is the biggest one. The exit strategy now of this catastrophe of war is to return to negotiations, a long ceasefire agreement or truce, and Sudan needs $1 billion to provide fuel, wheat, electricity, medicine, etc. And and then if we don't get international aid, we will see famine very soon. We're not talking theoretically, and this is what was discussed by the government about a year ago. First of all, there should be a long-term truce based on negotiations to end the crisis, and then we start negotiating politically to deal with the root causes of this issue. It's a political issue, and we should return to that. Anything about decisively winning this war tomorrow is just wishful thinking because the real force here was the RSF. They spent a lot of money in it. They armed it. They did not care about the army that much. People are surprised that the army situation is bad because they never cared about it. The idea was they keep the army weak so that they avoid any military coups by it against the Muslim Brotherhood. They never try to take care of the army. First, they had the popular defense, which was called the border guards. Now, it's the RSF. Thank you.
Shukran jazilan. What you have mentioned is going to be leading to so much discussion during the Q&A. So I would like to start. If you wish to take the floor, please take only 2 minutes because I want to give the floor to as many people as possible. So 2 minutes approximately. Microphone, please. If you are going to take more than 2 minutes, I'm going to stop you, interrupt you. So please take the floor. Good evening to you all. There is a poem by Hamid talking about a blessing where you would see so he's reading some poetry. So he's talking about RSF and Kazan army, the Janjaweed. They represent the meaning of the poem that I just read to you when it comes to the future of the crisis in Sudan. A moment ago, Abdelaziz Al-Hello, the leader of the popular movement in the north, he was asked about his view with regard to what is happening between RSF and the military. He said both of them have fought us, have killed us, and we are not going to stop. We're not going to wait. We're going to wait until we see the victorious party for us to start negotiating with them. So my question is to Dr. Abushouk, Abdelwahab, and Mr. Hamza. If you can introduce yourselves, please. Your name, please. Ismi Hatim Al Yasser. I'm a lawyer and a previous governmental official during the Hamdouk government. I'm amongst the people who survived the crisis. There are a number of things that are basic with regard to the situation in Sudan. So there might be some cultural aspects as well, and also an economic dimension, because the military moved from a professional military that relies on the budget of the state into a business kind of military. The same thing applies to the RSF that is very much embroiled in economics. So in essence, these are attempts to have hegemony over the resources by RSF and the Sudanese military. They forgot about recruitment, rehabilitation, and they have tried to move and become an economic establishment. They try to emulate the Egyptian military. They trade in everything, in toothbrushes, in shoes, and this has had an impact on the military. So the same applies to the RSF. They started trading in gold and many other merchandise. Samir Amin said that in third world countries, they say that the authority or power is the way to wealth. So the political methods that are used, these are very weak, and the situation in Sudan is much more intricate, and there are some international intersections happening in Sudan. Muhammad Ibrahim said something really nice. He said that Sudan is a strong country, and he said it's a country, and try to compare the state to a vehicle with a very strong chassis. So we think that these tremors perhaps would put an end to the state. So we are not going to be similar to Somalia or any other country. So the political community is much stronger than the state. In those countries, they do not have CSOs and so on. I would like to take a question from this part of the room, please. In the name of God, the most compassionate, the most merciful, I would like to thank you very much for this seminar. And there was something that I was expecting to hear about, but I didn't. I think that the root causes of the crisis in Sudan, as Mr. Abushouk had said, the root causes is that there is a political and a cultural crisis. So this crisis exists in Sudan since 1956, and it's been 67 years we've been living in the same circle. All the failures that have manifested in Sudan, they appeared in the form of crises, wars, and we have seen what has happened in the central part of Sudan and in the north. And the worst period was the 19th of December. So the country is approaching a very close collapse. It's on the brink of collapse. So when we talk, Dr. Washuk talked about military coups, and the worst coup was by the RSF, as it happened on the 14th of April. So they have occupied six airports. They control TV, Mario Airport. Isn't that a military coup? So this should be added to the many, many coups that have happened in Sudan. I think that this seminar is going to discuss the future of Sudan after the war. I think we need months for people to reach recommendations in order to reinforce the possibility of Sudan continuing as a unified state. So we do not have the December Revolution. So the December Revolution is part of the crisis. That is why we've entered into this war. So we had an opportunity with Hamdouk. Had we continued with the efforts in order to reinforce the civil state, perhaps we wouldn't have come to what we see today. So I'd like to take another question. And after that, I'm going to go back to the panelists and again to the speakers. I'm Musa from Qatar University. I salute the historical explanation that was given us. So we need to look at this crisis from a structural perspective, starting from the saying that says, so what is built on what is unruly is going to be unruly, or perhaps the wrong preludes lead to wrong outcomes. So as it was expressed by Dr. Hamid, so the establishment of the RSF was wrong because militaries should not carry out outsourcing. They should not find a force that would fight on behalf of them. So the RSF was a parallel military. The political parties do not control power through the military. The political parties do not agree with sectarianism. There have been a number of ideas about the history of Sudan. So Abushouk should tell people that it's not necessary that that Sudan is a strong country. There are some countries that prevailed and disappeared. So we can witness the disappearance of Sudan similar to any other countries. We cannot say that the situation is going to be better. So I would like to go here to the middle of the hall, please. My name is Dr. Al-Walid Adam Adipo. I have a question to Mr. Hamid. Hamid said that the RSF is going to be defeated. But we know that. But what is the cost going to be? Because the military does not have a clear strategy whereby it would be able to defeat the RSF. And this is very dangerous indeed, because you're using aircrafts while there are some ground forces. So Abushouk concentrated on a point that had been neglected. There is a community or a societal division. So the root cause is due to regional crises. There was a crisis between people of the north and people of the south and the west. So I'm going to annoy a little bit Mr. El-Affendi. Dr. El-Affendi, do you think that the priority is for governance or democracy. Colombia had to take 15 years to move from authoritarianism to a democratic regime. I think that from after 2 to 3 years, we can move to democracy, but knowing that there are so many structural issues, deep issues in Sudan. طيب بهاء الدين, graduates of the Doha Institute. So the panelists did not objectively talk about freedom and change and how they deal with the military and the RSF. Mr. Hamza said that the framework agreement has no problems whatsoever. In actual fact, the items of the framework agreement is excellent when we talk about the drafting of the agreement. But when it comes to the procedures that have been undertaken until the agreement was concluded, it's very dangerous because there has been pressure exercised on the military by the RSF, clear pressure. We're not talking about a declared coalition between freedom and change and the RSF. There are a number of interests that were concerted in order to implement the framework agreement in order to exercise pressure on the military. And this happened after Al-Hamid announced in February 2023 that the procedures that have taken place are a coup and not a corrective measure. Dr. Abushouk was very objective, but he forgot that there was a circumstance that has happened whereby we had two political trends, and this happened in February 23. So we have two parallel political lines. So the RSF, for the first time, came up with a statement that was in contradiction with the military during the first phase, the first transitional phase, until the second transitional phase. We undergone a civil military crisis, whereas in the past we had a military crisis. Our problems used to be crises between Islamists and civilians. So we did not look into those contradictions. So we have seen contradictions amongst the military members themselves. So, is this coalition, is it a declared one? It is not very clear. So most of the interventions were opinions. So that is why I'm going to go to this part of the hall. Mr. Anas, please.
I'm not Sudanese. I'm very confused about the situation. I'm not really sure how I understand that. Maybe after this seminar, I'm even more confused. But thank you, panelists. This is a very nice seminar, but I need to understand the situation on the ground. You said that most of you seem to be of the opinion that the RSF is on its way to be disappearing from the scene. Now, the interest in the media in the Sudan affairs has fallen back to the third or second position. Do you have national service conscription in the Sudan or not? And also, Dr. Kabalan, I make a recommendation. The Arab Center has produced such a study, but I think a study should be conducted into Arab national armies and the supporting forces. They played a crucial role in Iraq, in Syria, in Sudan now, in Saudi Arabia. I think we need to study the relationship between the regular army and these paramilitary forces. We will refer your proposal to the Security Studies Unit. Assalamu alaikum. I have 3 questions to Dr. Hamid and 1 question to Dr. Abdelwahab and 1 to Dr. Hamza. Dr. Hamid's questions. My first question, can we build democratic institutions as you called for without dismantling the deep state and the former regime, and who is responsible for obstructing the dismantlement of the former regime and obstructed the transformation to democracy? Secondly, you said you called for going back to the situation before the war. I personally disagree. I think people who agree with either side, the army or the RSF, and not people who calling to stop the war and say no to war. My third question, you said there are some deformities in the army, like interfering in politics, and also the very makeup of the army. But you forget one thing, that it is by and large under the authority and influence of the Islamists. When Turabi said that 95% of the army is made up, of the officers corps is made up of Islamists, he said that in the 90s. I don't know why you ignore this fact. Thank you very much. For Dr. Abdelwahab, you said that civil war means dialogue, but can dialogue be possible with a, a political wing which has a military wing, an armed wing? We talk about civilians. Can we classify them as civilians? My final question to Hamza. Do you have any other vision apart from the framework agreement? The war and its current situation, I think outside Khartoum there is no fighting, or am I wrong? There isn't real war outside Khartoum. Is this feeling normal or natural? And also, and from the beginning of the conflict until now, we only hear about fighting in the vicinity of the presidential palace and certain places. The military powers, the military balance between the two warring sides are not clear to me. It's not clear to me. Uh, Let us go back to the panelists to give them a chance to respond. Some of the interventions were comments and not questions. Mr. Hamza, would you like to go first? 2 minutes, please. The 2 minutes are not enough. I pose a question to Mr. Muhammad Sulaiman. We're talking about a political solution. The solution should be political and not through using guns, because now people are going back to negotiations. So therefore, this is not the main issue. whether the reason was the framework agreement. First, the guns should be silent, and then there'll be negotiation, and also the international partners should use their leverage. There was a question, an important question. If you give me 1 minute, I don't have information about what the that the army was pressurized. And I was Minister of Information. They gave us a big hall as it was when they had a conflict with the RSF, and at the end of this round of conflict, they sent us a letter saying that these offices were handed over to the RSF, which is of a strategic importance. What I'm trying to say that they were not expecting to fight each other. Even this talk about occupying the TV and radio, because the army was inside and the RSF was outside. They knew as military people that if fighting broke out, the army will be surrounded because they were inside and the RSF were outside. When the war started, the RSF surrounded the army. I think there is a strategic question that the RSF was paid for from our money, our taxes as Sudanese people. So therefore, they should be reformed, not just like the army, and not to break them up. And if the war continued for 1 more month, the Sudanese army will not be able to resist any challenge which requires the Sudan to act in a military way. The Sudan will not be able to. So, in whose interest is it if the country is left defenseless like this? This is the question you should pose. Why should we continue in the direction of war? Because war will destroy everybody and leave the country defenseless. And thank you. Three quick points. The first, in political analysis, I always tend to the agency and the role of the agency and the people's choices. Like similarly to when we studied the war in Darfur, my conclusion was that the war was the consequence of decisions by the political and civil forces. John Garang at one time said it should start a movement in Darfur. The government decided to deal with what was a small uprising in a military way, and there was a decision by the governor of Darfur, Dr. Ibrahim Suleiman at the time, who wanted a peaceful solution. The government said no, and therefore there are decisions which were taken at that time which could have changed the direction. I know there is talk of a drought and other environmental reasons. Yes, these were present, but how you should deal with these issues is what governs the situation. Like, for example, if governments decided to arm the Arab tribes in Darfur to fight Garang, this created an imbalance. And this is a response to Dr. Madibo's question about democracy. when the Hamdok government was formed, Sudan was in the best situation. There was total international support. There was almost total popular support. Even the Islamists have given up and left the situation to the political forces at that time. At that time, if the correct decisions were taken, as I said, to like the foundations of democracy were laid down, and I mention here what Muhammad Sulaiman has said, instead of keep on saying the Islamists are conspiring, when the Turabi said in 1990, they got rid of Turabi, al-Bashir, and the army deposed him, and they wanted to depose al-Burhan or al-Bashir. So now there is a new reality. The army is defending itself as a professional force against the RSF, and I disagree with Hamza. First of all, the barbarity which were called by the RSF in Vietnam, looting, destruction, rape. This is not acceptable, neither in Sudan nor everywhere. This is a criminal. But the people, whether the people have paid for it or made, they were created by al-Bashir or others, this is not acceptable. How can there be democracy with a military force which is the personal property of one person and is criminal in its practices? You cannot coexist with it in any way. If one of these politicians decided to walk on the street and said to the people, let us deal with RSF, who would listen to them? Many people were angry even at the prospect of engaging in dialogue with them in Jeddah. Democracy could have been established, and it can be established now. I think it's still possible, and I called for this in one of my interventions, that the army should open up a dialogue with political forces. Now we don't have a civil power. We need to. Yes, the situation in Khartoum is not conducive to that, but there is the possibility that we cannot escape without democracy. Any arrangements for a sound government according to the way it's done in Sisi's regime or the UAE will end up in corruption. So I'll conclude by even people like us who are sitting here, we should not wait for Al-Burhan or Hamid. We should do something. Thank you. Dr. Hamid. Thank you, Dr. Walid and Dr. Madibu. For the RSF, we agree in the details, but the problem for the RSF, all their life they relied on their sustenance supplies on the government. The first thing they discussed in Jeddah was how their salaries should pay, because the vast majority of them joined the RSF is for financial gain, and they don't have a political vision or ideology. This project is an opportunist, it's a personal one, and they have narcissist ideas that to establish an emirate and his brother will be his heir apparent, and this kind of crazy talk which cannot thrive in Sudan. And I think 70% of them were destroyed, and now they're totally unoperational and they're sitting in farms. Yes, this is a very costly war for the citizens, but at the end of the day, the army built this establishment and they know how to deal with them, and and also they know how to deal with them. And even when they resorted to infiltrating civilian communities and hide amongst them, the army is finding ways to reach in them, and people are giving the army the coordinates of where they are. I think this is just a matter of time. As for Muhammad Sulaiman and some of his questions, first of all, should we build institutions or follow persons? If there is a Sudanese person who is not partisan, is professional, we should not remove him and bring someone who has a political affiliation. Maybe they replaced people they brought. They in the period of transition, they removed people and from their positions they brought their own. This is very dangerous. Some still look at the state as ways of employing your own people and your cronies and nepotism and etc. This is the old way that they accuse the government they follow. So therefore we should build institutions and then we find the proper persons to lead this transition or transformation. This question of saying no to war, I think we all agree. Nobody will say yes to war unless they are absolutely out of their mind. Unless we want to use these slogans just to cheat the people. Even the freedom and change and started talking about who will be part of this framework agreement. They should not decide that only by themselves. They bring people who are not even qualified. The opportunity should be open to all Sudanese people. There are people who are not good enough to hold any position. They end up taking this position, and this leads to corruption. They really institutionalize corruption. So they want for the quartet, they want to sit the RSF and the army at one table, and now we are moving from that to political negotiations. For political negotiations to start, a Volker is there. If I had the power, I should kick this Volker guy out, and because he gets $40,000 a month at our expense. I think this is just used as a pretext. Thank you, Dr. Hamid. Dr. Ahmed. Thank you very much. I said in the beginning, the academicians we restrict ourselves to the title we are giving. The title was the Army-RSF conflict, but if we look at the crisis of the Sudanese state, it's very deep, and like what Dr. Madibu and Mr. Hatim Ilyas have said, it has a social aspect, and there is divisional. There is also regional divisions and the cultural aspect. So therefore, the question, and right from independence, the Sudanese state suffered from mismanagement of resources and mismanagement of the diversity culturally and ethnically, and we needed some positive discrimination to deal with the marginalization of some areas. The second question by Baha, yes, it's a complex struggle. It's on the one hand, it's an army struggle. It's an Army-RSF struggle. It's armed forces against civilian forces without an objective reading of this. And also the center with the peripherals, the ethnic conflict, the this war can expand horizontally and allow for outside neighboring countries to interfere, and the country will end up in a state of civil war. I'm not a military person, but I can comment that yes, it seems that the war is confined to the Khartoum area. Sometimes it spreads into the Darfur region because war in the Khartoum is as an urban warfare situation, and Khartoum is spread horizontally. The RSF is a rapid deployment force. It's a infantry force, so they started taking people as human shields and sitting in their houses, and the army has no manpower to calm these areas. And the army thought by bombarding the bases and the camps, they will finish off the RSF. But you have 50,000 fighters using technicals or four-wheel drive vehicles, and they have the ability to move fast. It's a very difficult undertaking. As for the responsibility for the educated elite, is a moral and ethical one, because the state of Sudan post independently has gone through many crises, and we really need to build a strategic national vision to save the country from the current crisis, away from entrenchment and deep positions. Thank you very much. I think we have come to the end of the seminar. I just want to mention two important observations. The idea was to discuss a certain aspect as to why this conflict broke out between the army and the RSF at this particular juncture, and I think the four panelists tried to respond to that. And the state of the Sudan is a complex issue. It needs a much bigger seminar than this. Maybe we mentioned it in passing, but I want to mention also I'm not that optimistic. I think this situation can be perpetrated, and we may need to hold another seminar soon. But in my estimation, the a decisive military end is not close. Maybe Dr. Ahmed said the number the number of RSF elements in Khartoum is larger than the army, and they are waging like urban warfare tactics. This is like guerrilla warfare. And the other thing, maybe the final point, that the if and now the idea for the outside powers was to evacuate the diplomatic missions and the foreigners. Now they've done that. They say, you Sudanese go and kill each other. Nobody's going to care much. But we, of course, we really hope that a political, peaceful solution is reached soon enough, because the Sudanese people would suffer. We thank all the participants, we thank the panelists, and we thank the speakers, of course, Dr. Abdelwahab, Mr. Hamza, Dr. Ahmed, Dr. Hamid, for their important contributions. Now, I think we have a better understanding of the situation in the Sudan, because we don't follow events that closely anyway. And thank you very much.